Today's daf is Lamed Zayin, and we'll begin on the top of the Omud, Beis Hil Matirin. On the previous Omud, Lamed Vav Hamid Beis, we mentioned in a brisa that Beit Shammai hold that you're not allowed to prepare what's called a pas ova on Pesach. If the dough is very thick, then we're afraid that it might come to chimus, and Beis Hil allowed it. So the Gemara now asks, "V'kama pas ova?" According to Beis Hillel, how thick can the dough actually be? Is there some sort of a shear, a maximum size or width of the dough, where even Beis Hillel at that point agrees that it's a chash chimutz, Omar Rav Huna tefach, up to a tefach but not beyond. And a tefach is considered a pas ova, a very thick pas, and Rav Huna feels compelled to bring a proof to support his position that even a pas ova, which is a tefach, is still considered controllable, meaning you can control it and make sure, guarantee that it's not chametz. My precedent for this is lechem aponim. The Torah says in the second chapter, Vayikra kol hamincha asher takrivu l'Hashem lo te'asa chametz. And the Gemara Menachos derives from the extra word kol, that kol mincha l'rabos is lechem aponim l'chimutz. So the lechem aponim should not come lidei chimutz. And in the case of lechem aponim, nevertheless, it's established in Menachos that tefach, it could be as wide as a tefach. And the derivation is from the word ponim, that the word ponim is an ovi tefach. Ein ponim chusos me ovi tefach. In any event, we see clearly, says Rav Huna, that in the case of lechem ponim, even though the dough is a tefach wide, nevertheless you can still protect it and guarantee that it won't come lidei chimutz. Maskif lo Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asks 5 kashes on Rav Huna, meaning there are 5 distinctions between our issue of a private person who's preparing his matzah in this case, as opposed to the Beis Hamikdash, where they were preparing lechem aponim. Number 1, im amru bizrizim yomru b'she'enam zrizim. Okay, in the case of Kohanim, there's rizim. They're very careful, and they make sure that it doesn't come to chimutz. And we therefore apply that same standard in a pas that's ovi tefach to shar b'nei adam, other people. They're not zrizim, they're not as careful and meticulous as the Kohanim. Number 2, im omru b'pas amela. The Mishnah establishes with regard to preparing the menachos that they did a lot of amelus, meaning they worked very hard with this dough in order to keep it going. This askus, continuous working the dough to make sure that it would not become chametz. And in Masechta Menachos on Daf Ayin Vav, it establishes that you need 300 shifshufim. Shifshufim means like massaging the dough 300 times. And chamesh meos be'ituf egrof, and 500 times they would bang the dough with their fist in order to make sure that they would slow down any process of fermentation. Is therefore Yomru v'pashena amela? In the case of a person who's making his own private dough, he's preparing it and putting it into the oven, can we guarantee that he'll work so hard on the dough to guarantee that it doesn't become chametz? Furthermore, im amru, in the case of lechem aponim, be eitzim yevashim. The Mishnah at the end of Masechta Tainis, when it talks about Tu B'Av, it describes the fact that they took the eitzim for the marocha only up to Tu B'Av, but after Tu B'Av already it became wet and moist, and they wouldn't use those eitzim. So the eitzim for the Eish al Gabi Mizbeach had to be taken from eitzim yevashim. They were dry logs, dry wood, and that would create an immediate fire and heat up the oven. Is Yomru, should we apply that to the case of matzah, the eitzim lachim, where people the whole year round will purchase logs for their furnace and for their oven, and these logs might not be so dry, they might be moist, and therefore the heat is not so intense, and it might come lidei chimutz. Furthermore, im amru b'tanur cham, the halacha was that when they prepared the lechem aponim in the oven, they would heat up the oven before they put the menachos, before they put, for example, lachmei todo, lechem aponim inside the oven. So it's got a very hot level of heat, and therefore it would not become chametz. But yomru, should we say the same thing should apply when a person puts his own in his own kitchen? He puts his dough into the oven. It's not insulated. It's not hot, and therefore the heat is not so intense. Im amru, in the case of lechem aponim, it's betanu shel mateches. The halacha is, this is a sugya mesechtes vachim and daf tzadi hey. Ein otzim klisharis micheres. All the klisharis were made of metal, and therefore the oven was made of metal in order to mekadesh the lechem. And in the case of a metal oven, the heat is very intense. Yomru, should we say the same thing applies to our household oven, which is a tanur shel cheres, and it's made of earthenware. It doesn't retain such an intense level of heat. It might come to chimutz. And now the Gemara has absolutely rejected Rav Huna, and we have to come up with a new answer to the question of Beisil Matirin. They allow you to bake even a pas ova. And now the Gemara is going to take an entirely different approach to explain the machlokas between Beisil and Beit Shammai regarding a pas ova. And that approach has nothing to do with Pesach, nothing to do with chametz. And the Rashba wants to know, Lamaskana, how do we paskin about matzah? Are we allowed to bake a matzah with a very thick dough? Should we be choshesh for chimutz, that it might come to become chametz? The Gemara doesn't clarify at the end of the day what exactly is the shear for our matzahs. Therefore, the Rashba says, since we don't have any definite knowledge about the thickness of our matzahs, therefore we should try as much as we can to make them very thin. And although the lisha itself, in a case where, let's say, the dough is a little bit larger, if he's constantly working the dough, b'shas halisha adam osek b'botzek, so we're not so afraid and we're not so concerned about a thick dough. It's not going to become chametz. He's very careful to constantly knead the dough. But when he puts the dough into the oven, there he's not handling the dough. He's not in any way manipulating the botzek, and therefore we have to worry about chimutz. For example, it could very well be possible that when he puts a thick dough into a hot oven, although the outside of the dough becomes crusty and bakes very well, there may be parts of the dough inside that don't get baked because they're not exposed directly to the heat, and they may become chametz. And therefore we should be very careful that the matzahs that we bake inside the oven, although they may be separated from a large dough, but they themselves should be very thin, dakos kechala yoser, as much as we can. In any event, the Gemara now takes us down a whole different route to understand the machlok between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about a pas ova. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba she'ilis es Rebbe b'yichud. I asked my Rebbe, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, in private, exactly what is the issue here between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. And who is your Rebbe? Manu, who is he? Rav. There's another listener that has a different transmission. Omar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Omar Rav. Rav Yirmiyah said in the name of Rav that Rav said Sha'altis es Rebbe. I asked my Rebbe privately, b'yichud. Umanu, and who's the Rebbe of Rav? Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. What was the question? My pas ova. What exactly is a pas ova? The subject of the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. And the response I got from Mori Varabi was pas meruba, was a very large dough, which was kneaded at one shot. And then when they set up the different pieces of bread, meaning they took dough and that larger dough and they divided into smaller parts and put in the oven, each loaf or each matzah was very thin. And my korule pas ova, and why is it called a pas ova? Mishum de nefisha belisha. In other words, when you knead the dough and it's a very large dough, it's going to take you a lot of effort to accomplish your goal. Ibais ema. Another way of explaining the language pas ove be asrei the high tana le pas meruba pas avu karile. That the phrase pas ove was a there was a local language that they used to describe a pas meruba. So he's really taking a massive amount of bread. And my time. So what was the hesitation of Beit Shammai? If we're not talking about Pesach, and we're talking about a problem that applies on every yontif, the Gemara says, it must be that on yontif we're not allowed to extend ourselves to stretch it too far and get involved in a great deal of tircha. What you need for yontif, that's one thing. But if you're making such a massive amount of bread that you can't even consume it on yontif, it must be that you're preparing it for chol, for the weekday. So that the reason why Beit Shammai prohibits this pas ova has nothing to do with chametz on Pesach. It has to do with tircha that's not justified on yontif. Is my area Pesach? Why does the Brisa record the machlokas between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai as a Pesach issue? Afil b'yontif nami, any of the Shalosh Regalim, we have an Issa to do a tircha yisera on yontif. Now I'm not sure if the Gemara means that it's really considered ofemi yontif lechol, because that has to do with a sugya later on in Masechet Pesachim, Machlokas Rabbah and Rav Chizd about hoil. Maybe it has to do with the lisha, the fact that he has this large dough. He's going to expend a lot of energy in order to knead the dough. And that's unnecessary because there's no way that he needs that amount of dough to produce the volume of bread that he needs for yontif. Gemara says, the only reason why the Brisa mentions Pesach is because the question that came up at that point, at that moment of time, was the yontif of Pesach. But it really applies equally to every yontif. And Tanya Nami Hachi, in fact, we have such a Brisa, Beit Shammai Omer remain ofin pas ava b'yontif. And here it says yontif, it doesn't mention Pesach because it applies to all regalim, Beis Hillel Matirim, they allow it. Why do Beis Hillel allow it? I mean, after all, Beit Shammai has a very good argument. He doesn't need that amount of bread for yontif. And the answer is that Beis Hillel are of the opinion that the more you put in the oven, the better it is and improves the quality of all the lechem. And this is what Rashi says at the end of Masechet Beitza, Beis Hillel Matir Mishum, Shekshetanur Malei Belechem, when the oven is filled up with many breads, Nefes, Hapas, Yosetov, it improves the quality of the bread. So that's the sheet of Beis Hillel, and therefore we can certainly justify this tircha yisrael. Taner Rabbana. Now we get back to matzah. Now it seems that back in the day of the Talmud, we don't really see this today. They used to make shapes out of the matzah. And that's going to be the case of what's called matzah mitzuyeres. So we'll get to that in just a minute. First of all, Taner Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, yotzim b'pas nekiya. You can use very fine white flour that's been sifted so well that we removed any of the bran, and that's not considered matzah shira. That's not considered a rich man's bread, and the Torah requires lechamoni. This is also considered matzah valid for the mitzvah Pesach, and that's derived from, as we saw back on Daf Lamed Vav, matzos riba. V'chein, also, you can use hidra, just the opposite. You have a pas kibar, which is made from very, very thick flour that's got plenty of bran in it, and ubesrikin hamitzuyarim b'Pesach. You can even use matzos where they did sritos. They made these incisions in the matzah to make beautiful shapes. They added an artistic flavor to their matzahs. But nevertheless, afal bisha amru ein osin srikin hamitzuyarim b'Pesach. If all things are ideal, we did not make these beautiful shapes on our matzahs on Pesach. If he did so, he can use it for matzah, and it's not considered matzah shir. He can fulfill his mitzvah of erev tochlu matzahs, but that's only been the evidence. We should avoid making these srikin mitzuyara b'Pesach. And Amar Yehuda Dover Zeh Shal Baitos Ben Zudin Lechacham Nema Amru Ein Osin Srikin Mitzuyom BePesach. This fellow by the name of Baitus, not related to the Baitus who was Kofer B'Torah Shval Peh, but anyway, this Baitus asked the Chachamim, why are you so inhibited about making these beautiful shapes in the matzahs? Amrullah, the Chacham responded, because when she's making these beautiful shapes in the matzah, in the dough, it's going to delay the whole process of putting it into the oven. And in the meantime, during this shehiyah of Zman Meruba, machmatzta, it may become chametz. Now, the Ritva asks about our matzahs because if we have something called osim shuros shel mekavim. If you're familiar with the Yiddish word radling matzahs, you make those little incisions into the matzah, the lines of the matzah. Why isn't that a problem of mitzuyarim? And he answers that the mitzuyarim that the Gemara is talking about are not just little incisions and lines in the matzah, but rather they made it into tzuras chayav, the ov, that different kinds of shapes, and it took a long time in order to accomplish your goal. This is something that we should avoid. So Baitus turns to the Chacham and he says, Efshar shiaseno b'tfus. What about a case where instead of handmade shapes, he used a tfus, like a cookie cutter, some sort of a tfus, so it's the kavan. In other words, he's mechaven it such that immediately when he puts down the tfus, automatically it makes the shape that he needs, and therefore he's not going to be showing the dough. He's not going to delay it, and it won't come lidei chametz. The Chacham weren't excited about this because Yomru kol asriken asurim visrike baitus mutarim. People are not going to understand and appreciate the difference that you make between the srike baitus, which are made with a tfus, and other srikin that are made by hand. And they'll make a mistake and they'll think that even if they don't have a tfus, because at the ultimate accomplishment, the matzahs look identical, whether or not the picture on the matzah was made with a tfus or was made by hand. So we don't want to risk that confusion, that people will jump to the conclusion that if srike baitus are mutarim, then our srikin could also be mutarim. All right, Lazar bar Sodo Pamachas Nichnasti Achar Abel Beis Rama Gamliel. So Belazman Sadok relates that he once went with his father of Tzadok into the house of Rama Gamliel. He viewed the fun of Srikim Mitzuyam B'Pesach, and they brought out Srikim Mitzuyarim. These were beautiful shapes and very artistic matzahs. And Amarti Abba, I turned to my father. And I said, why is this going on here in the house of Rabbi Gamliel? Isn't it true that the Chachamim said, "Ein osim srikim mitzuyah b'Pesach"? We don't make such matzahs. Omar li, b'ni, he said to me, my son, lo, b'srikin shall kol adam amru. The Chazal did not have a blanket iser that applied to everyone. And although it's true that stam b'nei adam are not so makpid, and they may or may not leave it for a long time. So here the Gemara is going to present two lashonos, two variations of exactly what Rabbi Tzadok answered to his son Rabbi Lazar. According to the first approach, the statement of Rabbi Tzadok was the following: the Rabbana did not make a blanket issue that you're not allowed to make tziyurim. Most people, in fact, would be very careful when they beautify their matzahs with these tziyurim, with these shapes and forms. They would not allow the matzah to remain idle for a long period of time, such that it might come to chametz. When did the Rabbanan say we have to avoid these matzos that are srikim mitzuyarim? That's only ella shel nachtomim, the professional bakers on it, because they're selling this matzah on the open market, and that's how they get their income, and therefore they want to make sure that it's absolutely beautiful. They're very makpid, they're very meticulous about the beauty of the matzah, so they could sell it, and in competition market they could outdo the next one. So they delayed the creation of these matzahs, the baking the matzahs, and therefore it might come to chametz. But as far as Bnei Adam is concerned, Stam Ben Adam, he's not so makbid on the noi, on the beauty of the matzah. Therefore, he would not delay the matzah. That's the first transmission of the words of Rabbi Tzadok. Ika Diamri, the second transmission, the Lishna Bas, is just the opposite. Hachi Kamerli, this is what Rabbi Tzadok said to his son, Rabbi Lazar. Lo shal nachtomim amru. The baked matzahs that we have at the house of Rabbi Gamliel, which are made with these tziyurim, those are privately baked matzahs. Those are, professionally baked matzahs, shel nachtumim. The nachtumim are professionals. They are what we call regilim ubikiyim. They're experts. And they use these tfusim. They don't sit there with their hands and try to figure out how to make the shape of an ox. They just simply have this casted cookie cutter. And therefore, we don't have any chashash that it might come to chametz. Ella shall kol b'nei, but all other people who do it by hand, we're afraid that maybe they'll delay the process of baking the matzah, therefore it'll come to chametz. Rabbi Yossi, osim srikim, kimin rekikim. We're allowed to make matzos mitziyoros if they are very, very thin, like a thin wafer, because such a thin matzah, even though it has a shape to it, will bake immediately and it will not come to chametz. But enos and srikin kimin gluskos. But if you have a thicker dough, like a regular, pita kind of dough that's very thick, then we don't allow you to make these shapes because it gets chametz thick very quickly if you'll just leave it and delay the process. Tanan Hasan. Now, at this point, the Gemara is going to enumerate various kinds of batzek, of doughs, and determine whether or not they are chayav in Challah. And we are going to start with a Mishnah in the first parak of Challah. Tanan Hasan, hasufkinin. Sufkinin are sort of like sponge cakes. In other words, they don't take the dough and pat it down very tightly, but rather it's very spongy with a lot of air space in it. And this is an unusual kind of a bread. Duvshinin, these are doughs that are fried together with oil. I'm sorry, with not oil, but honey. The iskritin, these are doughs that are made very, very softly. And once again, they fry them with honey. V'chalas hamasres, the Gemara is going to discuss this afterwards. It's some sort of a bread that's made in a frying pan. And I'm going to skip one word for a moment. Turim min hachal. All the above are not chayiv and chal. They're not considered lechem. And the Torah in the Parsha of Challah, in Parsha Shlach, says, Ba'acholchem milechem ha'aretz. Now, I skipped one word, meduma, because that belongs to a whole different category. Meduma is a case where you have a mixture of two types of doughs, or two types of flours. One is chulin and one is truma. They got mixed up together. And the Torah tells us, Tarimu truma lashem. And the Gemara tells us in Masechta Challah that this is to the exclusion of an Isa, which is already truma. In other words, Challah means you designate it and create truma. But in this case, it was already truma before he was mafresh Challah, because of the fact that there was no bittul, there was no bittul this taroves. And let's say, for example, in the case where there's rov truma, or even perhaps it's not bata barov, and that we have to go through the various shitas here about bittul. So the Gemara says, "My chalas hamasres." What was this case of quote unquote a chalas hamasres, which the Mishnah exempts from challah because it's not lechem? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi zech cholut shel balei abatim. It seems that the balabatim, the real rich guys, what they used to do is they used to take the dough and they used to dip it into very boiling hot water before they put it in the oven. And this would be a very outstanding kind of kind of loaf of bread. It's probably similar to what we call bagels. And it has a plus, it's a very significant thing. And that's not the normal way that you make lechem, because we take the dough, we put it right in the oven. They would put challah into the hot water, boiling hot water. And that's not tikkun lechem. Amar Reish Lakish says, halalu, what's the common denominator to all the categories that are listed in the Mishnah in Challah that are all exempt from Challah? Maaseh ilfashem. As opposed to an oven, which is preheated and you put the dough inside the oven, this is a maaseh ilfas. Maaseh ilfas means that you have some sort of a pan, let's call it a frying pan, and you put the dough into the frying pan, you put the fire underneath the frying pan, and that's not considered afiyah, that's not considered lechem, that's called a maaseh ilfas. The Torah says, v'afu eser noshim lachmechem b'tanur echad, and we're talking about lachmechem b'tanur, not lachmechem b'ilfas. Yochanan Amar maaseh ilfas chayavim. Rabbi Yochanan has a different take on these cases listed in the Mishnah in Challah, which are exempt from Challah. Halalu shason b'chama, these were baked in the sun, and the solar heat was responsible for the afiyah, for the baking of these breads, all of them, and therefore they're potter from Challah. They're not considered lechem. However, if you bake something on a fire, even if it's not in an oven, it's in a frying pan, that is considered lechem yechayiv and Challah. So we have this fundamental machlokus between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Reish Lakish holds that a maaseh ilfas is not afiyah, it's not considered lechem, and Rabbi Yochanan says it is considered lechem and it's chayiv and Challah. Now we have a whole series of objections raised against Reish Lakish. Sufkin, and we have a brayso that says Sufkin and Viduvchanim Viskritin. We described all those above. Asan be'ilfas chayavim. If he made them and he baked them, so to speak, in a frying pan or some sort of a pot, and it was on top of the fire, you're chayiv and Challah. That's considered lechem. But if it was made with solar heat, pturim, you're not chayiv and Challah. It's tuv to the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Here we have an absolute contradiction. Reish Lakish. Here we see that a maaseh ilfas is chayav and Challah. Omar Ula, Amal Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Let me give the answer that I think Reish Lakish would give if he was here. Hachmayaskin, in the case in the brayso that says yechayiv and Challah, is shertiach ulebesof hidbik. If you heat up a metal pot or a metal frying pan to such an extent that all you have to do is take the dough and smack it against the wall of this hot frying pan, and it bakes, that is considered, even according to Reish Lakish derech afiyah, it's considered lechem because it's very similar to the ovens. What they used to do is they took the dough and they smacked it up against the walls of a preheated oven, and therefore this is considered lechem and it's chayiv and Challah, even according to Reish Lakish. The Gemara says, Aval hidbik, or what about the case, according to Reish Lakish, if he first puts the dough onto the ilfas, and only afterwards, subsequently, hertiach, he turns on the fire. What would be the law, hachinami, pturin, according to Reish Lakish? You would be part in that case. And now the Gemara is going to ask the classic question of liflog v'lisnei b'didah. Something that I learned when I was in 4th grade, I remember, when we learned Eilu Mitzias. Adatani Seifa, Asan B'chama Pturin, when the Seifa of this brayso of the Mishnah looks for a case where you're potter, and it mentions the case of solar energy, why do you have to stretch your arm out to solar energy? Liflog v'lisnei b'didah, in a case of an ilfas. But Medvar Murim, when you're chayiv and Challah, in the case of an ilfas, that's all we could go and share tiach l'besof hidbik. First he heated it up. But if he first put the dough in and then he heated it up, that would be a maaseh ilfas, which according to Reish Lakish should be potter. And the Gemara answers, you're absolutely correct. You have to rewrite the brayso. This is the way it should set it. But when do you say a maaseh ilfas is chayiv and Challah kisher tiach l'besof hidbik? That's in a case where he first heated up the oven, the pot. If first he put the dough in, That equals the case of solar energy, and this reformulation of the Brisa supports Reish Lakish. Now the Gemara raised another objection to Reish Lakish from a different Brisa, Tashma. We have another Brisa against Reish Lakish, Yotzim b'matzah hina. We can fulfill our mitzvah with a very weak matzah, meaning it's hardly baked. U'b'matzah suya b'ilfas, and even a matzah that was made in a frying pan is also matzah. It's considered lechem oni, and you don't say the mitzvah. And if it's considered lechem as far as matzah, then ipso facto, it's considered lechem to be machayiv you in challah, and that's against Reish Lakish, who says that my silfus is part of challah. And the old answer, hachanami, when the Brisa says you're chayiv in challah and you yotze b'matzah, that's hirtiach ulubesofid. That's because he heated up the ilfus first, and only afterwards he put in the dough. My matzah hina. The Gemara wants to know what was this case of a very soft, unbaked matzah. How much was it baked? On Rabbi Yehuda and Shmuel, it all depends. Kol sheparsa v'ein chutin imshachem emena. If you break it and you don't see strands of dough that still stretch, then it's considered baked, and it fulfills the basic definition of afia for matzah. But if when you break it, you see that it falls apart, the various parts, strands of the dough fall apart, that's not even a matzah hina. Amar Rava says, v'chein b'lachmei toda. In the case of lachmei toda, where what happens is when a person, arbot tzrichim lahodos, he's chayav in a carbon toda, he brings together with the toda 40 lechamim from 4 different minim. 3 of those minim, meaning 30 out of the 40 chalas, are matzah, and those are called chalos, rekikin, and revucha. And then there's one min echad that has 10, which is chametz, and those are lechamim. Those are made of lechem. Now, when he shechts the carbon toda, that generates a kiddush, a sanctification of the lechamim. What is the state of lechem at the moment that he shechts the lachme, that he shechts the carbon tummy? And the answer says, Rava, it has to be baked to the shir of afia, that if he breaks them, you won't see the stretching of the various chutim. The Gemara says, Pshita, why did Rava feel compelled to teach me that the same halach in Challah applies to lachmei toda? And the answer is because hachal lechem ksiv, hachal. Yeah, so the Gemara asks, hachal lechem ksiv, hachal lechem ksiv. Both in lachmei toda, the Torah says halchalos lechem chametz yakrivu karbano, and in the midst of matzah says shivas yom tochel matzahs lechem oni. So what would I have thought without Rava? Ma'al I would have thought the following: Hol uksiv. The pasuk says there in the parsha of lachmei toda vayikra perik zayin. V'kriv mimenu, and here we turn to Lamed Zayin and Beis Echad mikol karban truma Hashem. Let's emphasize the word echad. And what are we going to derive from the word echad? Echad shelo yitol parus, that when you give the kohen his share, one of each of the 4 categories, each one that has 10 lechamim in it, don't give him parus. Give him something that's absolutely shalom. It's echad. It's complete. And but here in the case of a bread or a matzah that wasn't baked totally, maybe we should consider it as if it was broken up, because it's going to break very easily. And as soon as you move it from place to place, it'll start breaking. Therefore, I needed Rava to teach me the chiddush that this is not considered parus. Right now it's whole, and even though it's at a very early stage of baking, if you would break it, you would not see the various prusos coming out, and therefore it qualifies as lechem.